Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give everyone a few seconds to finish log in, and then we will officially start. Okay, we have about 53 people and going up, so I will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rose Cuizan-Villazor. I am the Interim Dean of Rutgers Law School. I am also the Director of the Center for Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice, and I am excited to welcome all of you today to our annual Distinguished Immigration Law and Citizenship Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Mei Nai of Columbia University. We are also pleased to include in the conversation Professor Jack Chen of Rutgers University. Let me just tell you a little bit about the immigration lecture. Every year, the Center for Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice selects a leading immigration and citizenship scholar who can deliver a lecture to help us better understand what membership means in the United States. And so with us today is Professor Mei Nai. Her talk today is also part of a new initiative, the Asian American Pacific Islander Law Initiative that was launched by the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and the Law that is headed up by Dean Suzanne Kim and the Center for Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice. We'll tell you a little bit more about the AAPI initiative, but for now, let me just pass the mic over to Dean Suzanne Kim.
Thank you so much, Dean Cuizan-Villazor, and thank you so much, Professor Nai and Professor Chen, and all of our students here and all the attendees for joining us. I'm delighted to co-sponsor today's distinguished event, as well as the AAPI and the Law Initiative. I direct the Rutgers Center for Gender, Sexuality, Law, and Policy, which, as many of you know, serves as a cross-sector hub for students, faculty, practitioners, and policymakers who are focused on issues of equity and justice as they intersect with gender, race, sexuality, economic justice, and other social dimensions, both domestically and internationally. So I'm delighted to be part of this event and to help to co-sponsor. Thanks so much.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Joseph Lin. I'm a third-year law student here at Rutgers Law School, Newark, and I wanted to share a little bit with my classmate Sam about the origins of the AAPI and the Law Initiative. It was a response that started in March 2021 at the height of the COVID pandemic, the rise of anti-Asian violence, and the shootings in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women. The Asian Pacific American Law Student Associations in Camden and Newark had a grieving session. And, out of those conversations, we really identified that there were things missing in the national conversation about what was happening, decontextualization of what was happening, in amnesia of the history of exclusion and hate against AAPIs, and also a erasure of the intersection of gender, race, and class. And so we saw that, for instance, in Atlanta, the Asian American Advancing Justice and local NAACP, the community groups were very quick to respond to the issues, to what happened in Atlanta, to provide resources on the ground. And so we thought at the law school, what could we do as students, faculty, scholars to activate our networks and challenge systemic racism from an AAPI perspective. And so that was part of the impetus for creating this initiative.
So this project is basically trying to contribute to scholarship on the relationship of the AAPI experiences and other racial groups, and demonstrate how legal doctrines and policies have shaped communities in the past and present. So the first part of this project really is the seminar part, where we have a speaker series where we had introduced practitioners and scholars who work closely with AAPI communities. At our first event, we had Gisela Perez-Kusakawa from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who kind of contextualized our series by going through Asian American jurisprudence, as well as her current work in the China Initiative, combating Southeast Asian deportation and Islamophobia. Our second event featured Professor Bob Chang and contextualized his work and the importance of critical race theory, very pertinent conversation that was happening. And then our event last week featured Professor Donna Lee, who provided us an overview of anti-Asian violence in the context of domestic violence in the API community. The second part of this project is a directed research project where students develop research and substantially affect API communities. Participants in this cohort are the students that you see on screen, include myself, Emily, Lydia, and Joseph. So I forgot to introduce myself, but I am also a 2L at Rutgers Law School Newark. We wanted to also emphasize that this was sort of the brainchild of students and with the support of admin, especially from the two centers, the Center of Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice, and the Center of Gender, Sexuality, Law, and Policy. And so because of this sort of new directed project, there wasn't really a textbook, right? So we had to essentially organize a syllabus with existing scholarship according to some of the topics highlighted that I mentioned in our speaker series, as well as any topics related to the papers that we are writing for this directed research project. And so through this cohort, we wanted to foster a collaborative environment, as well as feedback on our topics, while even though our topics are different, are still tend to be very interconnected. And so I will pass it back to Lydia.
Welcome, Professor Nai. I would like to introduce Professor Nai a little bit. Professor Mei Nai is a long family professor of Asian American Studies and History and co-director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and the Race at Columbia University. She is a U.S. legal and political historian interested in histories of immigration, citizenship, nationalism, and the Chinese diaspora. She is the author of award-winning books, including the one we're talking about today, The Chinese Question, The Golden Rushes and Global Politics. And she has written on the immigration history and policy for the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and Dissent. Before becoming a historian, Professor Nai, she was a labor union organizer and educator in New York City and working for the District 65-UAW and Consortium for Worker Education. She is now writing and working on the book, Nation of Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea. Welcome, Professor Nai.
Thank you so much. And thank you especially to Dean Cuizon-Villazor and Dean Kim. It's a great honor for me to talk to you today, and I look forward to our conversation with Jack Chen, who I haven't seen in a while, so it's great to see you, Jack. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. How is that? Are we good, Rose? No, I have to do play from start.
Yeah, play from start. Nope.
Okay.
No, that didn't
No.
do it. It did it the same thing again. Can you just go back to where you were at? Yeah. Oh, it appeared a little bit.
I'm gonna try something different.
Okay. There it is.
We good?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm still kind of tech challenged. Okay. Again, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real honor to just talk to you. So I'm going to talk about my book, The Chinese Question, which came out in August. The book is about the origins of the Chinese diaspora in the West and the rise of the racist movements and exclusion legislations against them. I look at the regime of Chinese exclusion that was enacted not just in the United States, but throughout the Anglophone world. Immigration and citizenship laws are nation-based systems, but nations also copy, borrow, and adapt from each other. So in this project, I was interested in the relationship between the local and the global. The Chinese question was simply this: are Chinese a racial threat to so-called white men's countries, and should they be excluded from immigration and citizenship? Exclusion was a radical idea in the 19th century because it contravened prevailing norms of free trade and free migration. Chinese exclusion policy was part of the globalization of the late 19th century world, an integration of the global economy at an unprecedented scale. Chinese exclusion was part of a new way of imagining, organizing, and governing the world. I locate the origins of the Chinese question in the gold rushes in the second half of the 19th century, focusing on California and Australia and the colony of Victoria, and in the early 20th century in gold mining in the British colony of the Transvaal. The gold rushes launched into motion hundreds of thousands of people from the British Isles, continental Europe, the Americas, Australasia, and China. Most notably, they were the first occasions of large-scale contact between Westerners, that is, Europeans and Americans, and Chinese. My ambition was to consider the histories of Chinese immigration and exclusion politics, as well as China's own development at this time, in one large historical framework: the place of Anglo-American settler racism in the development of global capitalism. It's a comparative and global study about the dynamics of race and money and of capitalism and colonialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. There are three major themes in the book. First, I want to slay the Coulee myth. This myth was central to the rationale that Chinese should be excluded from the countries of the West because they were a so-called Coulee race, indentured workers, innately servile and docile, and ruled by so-called despotic masters, and as such posed a threat to free labor and democratic government. This myth was also perpetuated by historians beginning in the 19th century, in the 1960s, with a book by Gunther Barth called Bitter Strength, who cherry-picked citations from congressional hearings to say that Chinese were unfree, although he ignored all other kinds of testimony that said otherwise. The subsequent literature cites Barth and the same testimonies, which led me to think that nobody had actually gone back to read the thousands of pages of the hearings that took place. Was it laziness, sloppiness? I think this created what I call an Orientalist blind spot in the historiography. So to slay the Coulee myth, I decided first it had to be an empirical question. That is, what was the social and labor organization of Chinese on the gold fields and later? If they were not indentured, then what was their situation? This angle is what led me to a social history of the origins of the Chinese diaspora in the West, starting with the gold rushes. Second, I addressed the Coulee myth as a discursive question. How did anti-Chinese politics arise on the gold fields in different national and colonial contexts? And how did they evolve into a global racial discourse? And third, I was interested in the relationship between the exclusion laws in the West and the rise of the international monetary gold standard and China's position in the global economy. In the interest of time today, and because this workshop focuses on immigration, I'll just touch on this last theme, but I'm happy to answer questions later. Okay, so Chinese immigration to the gold fields. The general pattern I discovered was that Chinese were both a part of mainstream gold field economies and apart from the Euro-American mainstream, a part of and apart from. For example, they used the same labor techniques as others and were part of congeries of cooperative gold mining, especially in the placer and hydraulic stages. Different ethnic groups introduced methods that became universalized. Perhaps the most famous is panning, which has its roots in the batea, a woven basket used in river mining in Spanish Mesoamerica. Chinese brought techniques of water management from southern Chinese aquaculture that became adopted by others. All gold seekers on the California and Victoria gold fields worked as partners in small cooperative groups and on wages for large companies. Like white Americans, Chinese worked with people who were relatives or from their hometowns, although village and lineage ties were stronger in the Chinese case. Chinese favored two kinds of organization in particular. One was the small company headed by an investor manager, typically a local merchant, often a former gold digger, who hired upwards of 20 men or leased their claims to others. The other form was the egalitarian cooperative, typically 6 to 12 men who shared all expenses and profits and had no boss. The cooperatives usually comprised members of secret brotherhood societies, fictive kin collectivities that were all related to the Zhigong Tang, which started as an exile group from the Taiping Rebellion in China and spread throughout Southeast Asia, North America, and Australia. In South Africa, Chinese were not independent prospectors, but indentured workers who were recruited to work in the underground mines of the Witwatersrand after the South African War. The Chinese on the Rand were mostly from northern China. Another difference from them and the US and Australia, where they came from southern China. But kinship and fictive kinship groups also existed on the Rand and were key to organizing resistance among the workers. On the politics of Chinese exclusion, the book tracks the local conditions that shaped anti-Chinese racisms and how these politics traveled and adapted around the Anglophone world, eventually merging into a global discourse, theory, and policy. The Coulee trope originated in California, where it drew from the proximate examples of indentured Asian labor in Caribbean plantation colonies after the abolition of slavery there and African slavery in the US South. The association of Chinese labor with slavery was a kind of racial shorthand that cast Chinese as a racial danger to free labor. It was first used in 1852 by California's first governor, John Bigler, who raised alarm over the, quote, present wholesale importation to this country of immigrants from the Asiatic quarter of the globe, that class of Asiatics known as coolies. He declared that nearly all were hired by so-called Chinese masters to mine for gold at pitiable wages, while their families in China were held hostage for the faithful performance of their contracts. Bigler called for the legislature to impose heavy taxes on the Chinese to, quote, check the present system of indiscriminate and unlimited Asiatic immigration. What was Bigler's intent? The Chinese in California were not coolies or indentured workers. But Bigler was in a tight race for re-election, and he used the Coulee myth to agitate voters in the mining districts where independent prospectors were anxious over the declining placers and the arrival of highly capitalized deep mining. This was a classic strategy taken from the nativist playbook: appeal to grievance with a theory of racial difference and weaponize it for partisan gain. Chinese community leaders responded to Bigler immediately. Two men I want to quote from are Tong Achik and Yuan Sheng, who are both from the region in what is now Zhongshan County in Guangdong Province near Macau. They were leaders of the Yang He Association, both educated men, successful businessmen, and fluent in English. Tong wrote a letter to the governor. He explained that of the Chinese in California, quote, none are coolies if by that word you mean bound men or contract slaves. He added emphatically, the poor Chinaman does not come here as a slave. He comes because of his desire for independence. Yuan Sheng had been a merchant in South Carolina in the 1820s and was a naturalized US citizen. He made a pointed analysis of Bigler's politics. In a letter to Bigler that was printed in the Daily Alta, the San Francisco newspaper, he wrote, quote, you have degraded the Negro because of your holding him in involuntary servitude, and because for the sake of the Union in some of your states, such as tolerated. Amongst this class, you would endeavor to place us, and no doubt it would be pleasing to some would-be freemen to mark the brand of servitude upon us. But he continued, we are not the degraded race you would make us. We come amongst you as mechanics or traders and following every honorable business of life, unquote. Yuan Sheng further used his own case as a naturalized citizen to refute Bigler's claim that no Chinese made the United States their permanent domicile or applied for citizenship. Tong Achik similarly argued, If the privileges of your laws are open to us, some of us will doubtless acquire your habit, your language, your ideas, etc., and become citizens, and we will be good citizens. In the 1870s, anti-Chinese racism became an incendiary political force in San Francisco, with the Chinese must go being the central demand of the so-called Workingmen's Party, which would soon be co-opted by the Democratic Party. The Chinese question revived in the context of the changing economic landscape after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. The railroad did not bring unalloyed prosperity to the West Coast. Not only did the former railroad workers, both white and Chinese, flock to the cities, adding to unemployment, but the railroad also brought more people from the East Coast, adding again to unemployment. The railroad also brought cheap, mass-produced goods from the East, cutting into the market of craftsmen and artisans. Chinese workers were not responsible for these broad trends, but they were useful to politicians as a scapegoat. Eventually, anti-Cooleyism triumphed in national politics, but only after revising the Burlingame Treaty with China, which provided for free immigration, and overcoming the legacy of anti-slavery politics in the North. Chinese exclusion passed Congress in 1882 with a political alliance between the West and the South, the two bastions of conservatism and white supremacy in the Reconstruction era, and if I may say, to this day. Now, the Coulee trope was so ubiquitous in the United States, I was surprised that it was not part of the anti-Chinese discourse on the Australian goldfields. But it would not have had purchase there because the history of bound labor or unfreedom in Australia was not African slavery, but convict transportation of the English and Irish poor. Anti-Chinese racism was more inchoate on the Victorian goldfields. There was no theory of Cooleyism like the one that had developed in California. More relevant was Australians' insecurity at being a small population at the fringes of the British Empire in Asia, only 400,000 in 1850. They feared being overwhelmed by China's large population. The Melbourne Argus wrote, "Geographically, we are nearer the pent-up millions of China than any other large tract of country occupied by the white man. We are still but a handful of men and women and children." The Coulee trope entered Australian politics later in the 1870s in Queensland, where whites felt threatened by Chinese and Pacific Islanders in mining as well as in agriculture. Australia posed an interesting case where plantations using cheap colored labor were not on separate island colonies like Jamaica or Mauritius, but in areas that were contiguous to white settlements in the temperate zones, areas that whites had staked out for themselves. In both New South Wales and Victoria, as in California, the Coulee trope became adopted by white labor movements in the cities, even though Chinese labor was not, in any of these places, a substantial threat to white labor. The urban labor movement in Sydney and in Melbourne adopted Coulee themes from California, which served to rally trade unions to the nationalist agenda unabashedly called White Australia. In South Africa, skilled white workers on the mines included many Australian immigrants, including the leaders of the British trade unions. They were direct carriers of anti-Cooleyism and the White Australia policy. Another source of anti-Chinese racism was in Afrikaner politics, which viewed Chinese labor as a threat to poor whites who suffered from high levels of unemployment and poverty after the South African War. Although Chinese labor was strictly controlled, white South Africans feared they would make their way into semi-skilled and skilled jobs and pave the way for their even greater fear that native African workers would do the same. This was at a time when the color line in South Africa had not yet hardened. The Chinese question was a problem that complicated the so-called native question, and its resolution, that is Asiatic exclusion, was necessary for the native problem to be fully addressed. Chinese labor in South Africa also shot into metropolitan British politics as a key campaign issue in the 1906 general elections in Great Britain. Charges that the Chinese on the Rand were kept in conditions akin to slavery helped bring the Liberal Party to power, overturning 20 years of nearly continuous conservative rule. It was especially powerful for the Liberals' labor allies, which echoed the abolitionist rhetoric, but which was, in my view, more moved by the question of working class immigration to the British settler colonies, which they viewed as their racial prerogative. In these ways, the Chinese question and the Coulee trope circumnavigated the Anglophone world, starting in California and adapting as it moved across the Antipodes and to South Africa, and then to metropolitan Britain itself. To the extent that they criticized the so-called slavery of Chinese workers, they did not call for their freedom, for free immigration, or for equal rights, but for their exclusion. In the last section of the book, I consider the relationship of exclusion politics in the West to China's position in the global economy and global politics. Most directly, exclusion meant fewer outlets for Chinese merchants and investors in the West. Exclusion meant a shrinking population and therefore a shrinking market, and many of the biggest merchants in California and Australia returned to China or relocated elsewhere. This was part of a general trend in which the energies of Chinese immigrant labor and capital moved mostly to Southeast Asia. The decline in silver prices relative to gold in the late 19th century had a direct impact on China, whose monetary system continued to be based on silver when the gold standard came to dominate international trade. The declining gold price of silver meant that China's imports were costlier. And the gold standard also influenced the second major round of war indemnities imposed upon China around the turn of the 20th century. The Opium War indemnities of 7.5 million pounds were reckoned in silver dollars and taels. After the First Sino-Japanese War in 1896, Japan demanded a 50 million pound indemnity, an enormous increase, but also demanded that it be paid in gold. China had to borrow on the international market at a time when silver prices were declining. And the Boxer Protocol of 1901 was even more punishing. The 8 powers, Europe, the US, and Japan, demanded an indemnity of 67.5 million pounds in gold over 39 years at 4% annual interest. By 1938, China had paid out over 91 million pounds. I'm just going to add with a comment about going back to Chinese immigrants and China's foreign trade. 2 American economists writing about China's foreign trade in the early 20th century made special note of the role that overseas Chinese remittances played in China's balance of trade accounts. Remittances ranged from an estimated $50 million a year between 1902 and 1913 and doubled that amount by the 1920s. Counted as assets, remittances enabled China to carry a modest net surplus in its balance of trade. So even as exclusion policies shut Chinese out of the social and economic mainstream in the West, the immigrants carried gold dust home in the linings of their jackets and sent foreign exchange through jinxian or silver letters. The fluctuating rates of exchange between gold and silver were not just matters for accountants and financiers. Chinese immigrants followed them as well. They always knew how remittances sent in foreign exchange would be reckoned in local currency. One of the great ironies of the Chinese question is that overseas Chinese in the United States, Australia, and Southeast Asia held on to their savings and remitted to China large amounts when the price of silver dropped. So I'm going to end there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Nye, for your remarks. My name is Emily Rathburn. I'm a 2L, and I'm also conducting research for the AIPI and the Law Initiative, and I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Chen. Professor Jack Chen is a historian, curator, writer, and dumpster diver devoted to anti-racist, anti-colonialist, democratic participatory storytelling, scholarship, and opening up archives, museums, organizations, and classroom spaces to the stories and realities of those excluded and deemed unfit in master narratives. Professor Chen has been honored to be the inaugural Clement A. Price Professor of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University, Newark, and director of the Clement Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience since fall 2018. Most recently, he is engaged with the global warming crisis, eco-justice, and the deep history of the region, founding the New York Public History Project of the Public History Project, funded by the Ford Foundation. And he has been appointed onto the New York City panel on climate change, dealing with the 31 county regional estuarial impacts we are all facing. He has been supporting 3 Muncie Lenape communities with their homeland efforts, reconstructing their language, maps, place names, and stories. So without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to Professor Chen.
Thank you very much. And it's I want to congratulate the students on the fantastic organizing work you're doing, and also Dean Cuisinart-Villazor and also Dean Kim for really this initiative and building up the important work that folks who have been involved in Black Lives Matter, Indigenous studies, and also, of course, Latinx studies have been doing. You know, the first thing that's really struck me about this work is May talking about 10 years, 10 years of work. And I kind of wanted to acknowledge the labor involved in that and the difficulties of that. But first, let me just say that this is a very important study, a study that really, in some ways, not only embodies the difficulty of doing this kind of work across many different national historical frameworks, but also requires a lot of traveling from different kinds of archives to different kinds of archives and working across languages. I just first wanted to say congratulations, May, for this masterful work, and I'm just so happy to see it come out, and it's getting the kind of fantastic reception that it's been getting. I should also say that I think this is also representing a kind of new watermark, a new level in which Asian American studies, Chinese diasporic studies, Chinese American studies has achieved. And it's also in many ways a great example of the ways in which an Asian diasporic, an Asian American, and I should say a Pacific framework really begin to intervene in what can be sometimes too narrowly framed national studies and nationalistic studies. But it's also of the caliber that is kind of upping the level, I think, of kind of progressive scholarship, certainly progressive historical scholarship, but progressive interdisciplinary scholarship especially. So I would just say that this is really part of an amazing generation of work that, for example, is of the caliber of Lisa Lowe's work in her fantastic kind of global framing of the intimacies of 4 continents, and her current work on the relationships between settler colonialism and racial capitalism. And it's also of the kind of ambition that Asian studies scholar Sucheta Mazumdar, who's at Duke University, has in looking at the opium trade as a global phenomenon, as a world systems phenomenon. So these kinds of studies, I think, have, first of all, their origins in Asian American studies, but also kind of open up fields of scholarship, fields of critical scholarship far beyond those traditional boundaries. And I should also just mention that Manu Karula, who is one of our graduate students at when I was at NYU in American Studies, has also written a very important book called Empire's Tracks: Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad. So we're looking at the ways in which what had been first been formulated as ethnic studies is beginning to really bear so many intersectional fruits by actually getting at fundamental questions of the formation of settler colonialism and white supremacy especially. So thank you for this work. And I guess I wanted to kind of maybe start out with just asking this question of the important role of framing the Chinese question, which can be oftentimes understood as the ways in which Chinese laborers and Chinese actors in this broad transnational global geopolitical drama can often be represented as victims. And it's very clear that you made a very concerted effort to not represent that. And you've pulled out some beautiful quotes and statements from the Chinese language archives that really push back on that. May, could you talk a little bit about that and the challenges of doing that, both in a practical archival sense, which really I think is important for students to understand, but also just in a broader kind of political sense of why that's so critical.
Thank you, Jack, so much for those kind words. Yeah, I traveled to a lot of places. I was, at some point I felt I had bitten off more than I could chew, let alone digest. So it took a long time. But on your question, you know, my research was kind of like, especially in California, where the sources are not well organized, or they're not all in one place. I felt like I was, looked at a million haystacks to find, 100 needles. But it was very important to me to show not just that Chinese resisted, because they did resist, but I also wanted to move beyond maybe an older model of oppression and resistance, like they oppress us and we fight back. And that mostly has to do with strikes, or kind of mass forms of protest. I just wanted to show that Chinese were people, that they were human beings, that they had similar life goals and desires as everybody does. And they brought with them from China forms of social organization and kinds of labor techniques, business models. And so I wanted to just show what they were and how they worked. And also that, on the gold fields, there's a lot of competition between groups, even within groups. It wasn't just Chinese and whites fighting with each other all the time. White Americans attacked people from Mexico, from Chile, even from Australia, other whites. They didn't like the French, they drove off the French. So there was a lot of competition, and white Americans used nationalism as a kind of weapon of competition, like the gold is for us, it's not for you. But also, it wasn't always fighting on the gold fields. People worked together, they got along. Chinese got along with others. So it wasn't just like a constant warfare either. So I wanted to just paint a more nuanced picture that showed people living and working together, fighting with each other. I mean, Chinese fought with each other too, right? I have some discussion of a murder trial of one Chinese who killed another Chinese. And I use that to illustrate something else. I use it to illustrate the problem of language and translation. But the fact it was a murder trial of one Chinese who killed another Chinese. So I wanted to get away, not just from the Coulee stereotype, but from the kind of, oppression v. resistance model, which I think has been, important and foundational in Asian American studies. But I think we need to have more nuanced and complicated histories. I think recently there's been a tendency to write like it's all violence all the time. And I understand the need to reveal the violence in the history of racism. I'm not trying to downplay that, but it's not all violence all the time either. And I think we need to look at racial violence and racial politics as politics. And if we understand it as politics, then we have some sliver of hope that we can organize politically against it, right? If it's just all violence all the time, then there's no hope, right, of anything ever changing.
Yeah, it's so important. And, I think those of us who come out of immigrant families, especially out of the kind of Chinese civil wars and coming out from some aspect of the diaspora, politics is kind of a dirty word for a lot of people, in which basically a lot of our families will tell us to stay out of politics entirely. And clearly that's not something that you've done. And I'm really grateful for that, because it's in some ways it's not shying away from it, but it's getting more deeply into it and understanding how politics is a process of contestation of real concerns that are representing real people and communities. So maybe that leads me to this kind of question, and I think it's exemplified in your work, that there's a contestation over coolies themselves and coolieism, as kind of a broad general stereotype, but also how colonists can use Chinese, right? So clearly there was an effort to start bringing in Chinese as, in some ways, strikebreakers, but also I found this fantastic document from 1879. You'll have to excuse my enthusiasm for kind of talking about finding these horribly racist documents as a fantastic document. But Sir Francis Galton, who, well, this is before he was knighted, is British man, well known, coining the term eugenics in 1883. And in 1879, he's writing a letter to a British newspaper advocating for Chinese to be brought into Africa, to dominate West Africa, and to become the replacement population that's there. So that from the British empire building point of view, but also later on from the American empire building point of view, this idea of bringing in workers and people from the outside into colonies is perfectly fine. But then you have this other standard, which is that if you're a British national, you don't want to bring those folks necessarily into your nation itself, or in this case, the United States as well, in terms of its US exclusion law policies. So could you talk a little bit about this kind of contestation amongst those who are in the positions of kind of manipulating the levers of empire, and who's included and who's not included, and how that contestation, of course, is very different than the contestation on the people-to-people level that you acknowledge so importantly?
I'd love to see that Galton letter.
I'll share it with you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the British Empire and other European empires, they all viewed colonized people as labor, a resource for labor, not only in the colonies where they resided, but also to move them around the world, especially to the former slave plantation colonies, right? So you see the British, especially using South Asian labor as indentures, shipping them off to everywhere from Mauritius to Guyana and Fiji, right? So that's a general practice of kind of moving labor around. And the United States did the same thing with using Filipino labor in Hawaii, right? And also for a while using them in California. Americans also brought Puerto Ricans to Hawaii to work on plantations. So I think the general problem with the plantation colonies is that the indigenous populations, diminished greatly. And then where there were African slave labor, that ended in the 19th century. So there's this big labor problem, right? But the other kind of colonialism you have, especially in the Anglophone world, are the settler colonies, where whites emigrate and try to replicate their home country. And North America is the same thing, right? North America is a hybrid because they have both settler colonialism and plantation colonialism. But so in those areas, which are in the temperate zones, right, they don't want to be like the plantation colonies. They don't want colored labor, and they hold dearly to their racial prerogatives that these are for white people. So they call them white men's countries. That's what they call them. They're unashamedly racial about who deserves to be there. And you can see that theory culminate around World War I with Lothrop Stoddard's tract, The Rising Tide of Color, which is all about white people being a minority in the world, and if they better defend the temperate zones because there's population increase, right, in Europe. So this is where, and by the time you get to the early 20th century in Great Britain, there's much more attention to the so-called dominions, right, the settler colonies, which achieve maximum autonomy, which is how they can set their exclusionary racial immigration laws. But also, you know, their value to the British Empire is recognized more and more from an economic standpoint. So I think in the question of empire, I think we're really need to distinguish between different kinds of colonies and the roles that they play in empire.
Yeah, no, thank you, May. That was really an excellent kind of reframing. Those who are not interested, those who have not been exposed to East Asian studies or Asian studies will not be aware of this framing of the Great Divergence. But it seems to me that it has incredible importance today and also frames so much of the ways Europeans, but Americans kind of assume certain kinds of ways in which the Chinese development is so fundamentally different. So maybe you could give us a little bit of that context and kind of translate it in terms of the way you've been tweaking and challenging that concept.
Oh, that's a great question. So there's a school of economic historians who argue, this was started by Kent Pomerantz, the book called The Great Divergence, who argued that China and Europe were not really that different until 1800. And then there was this great divergence where Europe became leapt forward with the Industrial Revolution and China did not. So, and part of the reason for that, they argue, is colonialism. But more generally, they're trying to say that up until this time, China had the same kind of capitalist or proto-capitalist development. And so there was, I think, an intention to show that China was not really backward or, you know, stuck in ancient civilization or, you know, Oriental despotism or whatever, that China was also on the same path to capitalism. So I think that there's, that's a double-edged argument. On the one hand, I think it's positive insofar that it shows that China, you know, had a kind of modern economic development that got then stunted. But I think there's a problem also in that argument, in that it says, well, China is just like the West after all. You know, you have industrial capitalism developing in the West, and look, China has the same thing. So China is just as good as the West. But I think that, you know, there's also a lot of danger in that argument. And I don't think it's also, some scholars have said it's not actually empirically accurate. And that China's economic development has to be understood on its own terms. And what people recognize as capitalist or proto-capitalist actually had Chinese distinctive features in China that were not shared in the West. And perhaps there is not one road to capitalism. Perhaps it appears differently in different parts of the world. And this idea that there's a normative capitalism, which is, you know, the English Industrial Revolution, is an invention of the English, right? It's a British invention and a Western invention. And we'd be better off maybe to understand global economic development as multi-sided, multipolar. Different forms emerge in different places and have their distinctive features. And of course, what blows all of this up is Western colonialism, right? It blows all of that up. But even, you know, throughout the late Qing dynasty, when China was greatly burdened by Western intrusions and oppression, China was still developing business forms, labor forms that are worthy of study. So I think the Great Divergence, I think ultimately reproduces this model of a normative capitalism that is Western based, which I think I object to.
Yeah, so May, our time is like zooming, and I'll just kind of wrap up with one question before this gets opened up to more questions for the viewers, which is that I think you make a very strong case, especially in the epilogue, of why the Chinese question is an ongoing one and something that has not been resolved. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and give some examples, because I think we feel it, certainly with the anti-Asian violence, although yellow parallelism and fears of Asians is not necessarily exactly the same as the Chinese question. So maybe you can just kind of help us.
Yeah, of course. Well, my general view about racism is that it's always particular and specific and contingent. So you never have the same racial idiom just repeating itself, right? Racism has to adapt to conditions as they change. And anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism reproduced over 100 years through various forms. I think in the 20th century, a lot of it was not so much from labor, but from, or immigration, but from the US wars waged in Asia, right? In our own time, I think what's interesting in our own time is that the competition with China is now the most acute thing in American China's policy. Biden has continued Trump's adversarial view towards China. And you have the Chinese question. I think I'll just give you two examples how it's reemerged. One is that China is going to take over the world, right? And so it's a zero-sum game. It's them or us. And second, the Coulee has come back. Who is the Coulee? The Coulee comes back in two figures. One is the factory worker in China, in Shenzhen and other, export manufacturing zones. They work, possibly long hours for little pay, and they're oppressed just like the coolies of the 19th century. And the other figure of the Coulee is the American university student, the Chinese American and Chinese foreign student in American universities who study way too hard, too many hours. It's unfair competition to normal white kids who couldn't be expected to labor under the lash of their tiger mothers. So I think you have the Coulee trope coming back to tell people that Chinese again represent an unfair competition. So I don't see this going anywhere good.
Yeah,
right now.
And the figure of Chinese as robotic.
Right, exactly.
And just never flagging in energy.
Right.
Is so much a part of it. And the kind of cyber Coulee, I think, that's associated with new technologies and relentlessness is stronger than ever, right? So yeah, May, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm just going to shift this back to the Dean.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you so much, May, for this rich and compelling historical account. I just wanted to offer some brief remarks before turning it over to the fellows who will moderate the Q&A. As a legal scholar, I have relied a lot on your work. As you know, I've cited your work in I think all of my law review articles. And what's important in my mind about your contribution to the literature here is that you really give us a deeper historical context about the origins of anti-Chinese and race-based legislation that came about during that were passed during this era. So from 1875, like the Page Act, which I see that Professor Letty Volpe is here. She's written about how that should be constituted as the first anti-Chinese law. Most people think of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act as the first anti-Chinese law, but your work really helps us to deepen our understanding of just how racist this era was against Chinese, that then expanded to other Asian groups that continued through until really 1965. So as a historian, you're able to give us this fuller account. From a legal perspective, I think about how limited equal protection law is and the Supreme Court's lack of recognition of this racism that was happening during this time. I mean, with the exception of maybe Yik Wo versus Hopkins, right? But that was a specific case regarding the treatment of Chinese who are already here, but we're really talking about, if we're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, we're thinking more about borders, and the Supreme Court ignored the racism that was happening and upheld the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1882 case of Che Changping. So I just wondered, you're a historian, but you've of course studied cases too. What do you think was happening? Why do you think courts were ignoring what was, they were aware of what was happening then, as you showed in your book? Why do you think courts were so, the Supreme Court and other courts were so, chose to ignore the significant racism that was happening during that time?
Thanks, Rose. Well, this period of the last quarter of the 19th century is the era in which the promise of the Civil War and the promise of Reconstruction are pushed back by white supremacy. So starting in 1877, with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, which paves the way for Jim Crow, you have a consolidation of a white supremacist bloc in the country, and with the West and the South joining forces. So there's a deal made, right? The South will support the West to exclude Chinese, and the West will support the South in terms of race legislation. The Supreme Court, in this period is really inventive, right, in defending white supremacy. This is Plessy is the legal fiction of separate but equal, right? This is also the occasion when corporations become legal persons and have rights under the 14th Amendment. So just as the Supreme Court moves away from the 14th Amendment pertaining to former slaves, it moves it to an economic right, for business interests and corporate interests. So I think, after the Civil War, this country had a choice. It could go in two ways. It could go the way in a democratic way, or it could go in a way where white supremacy would triumph. And unfortunately, it went the second way. So I think that's what happened in the late 19th century, and why Chinese exclusion in many ways, or the fate of Chinese in many ways, was yoked to the fate of African Americans after the Civil War.
Great, thank you.